The early morning sun was just beginning to warm the streets of Sarasota, Florida, as Officer Julia Martinez pulled out of the police station parking lot in her patrol car. She had been doing this job for 7 years now, but she still felt the same sense of purpose every morning when she put on her uniform. Today was February 22nd, and the weather was perfect. Clear skies and a gentle breeze that made the palm trees sway softly. Julia followed her usual morning routine. First, she stopped at Joe's coffee shop, where the friendly owner always had her regular order ready, a large coffee with just a splash of cream. She liked how the warm cup felt in her hands, and the familiar smell helped her feel ready for whatever the day might bring. While she waited for her coffee, she checked her equipment one more time, her radio, body camera, and the radar unit she would use for traffic monitoring. The morning traffic was starting to pick up as more people headed to work. Julia noticed how the sunlight made the expensive cars shine as they passed by. Sarasota was known for its wealthy residents, and she often saw luxury vehicles during her patrols. She had learned over the years that it didn't matter what kind of car someone drove. Everyone had to follow the same rules. Finding her usual spot on Oak Avenue, Julia parked her patrol car where she could easily see the traffic flowing both ways. This was one of the busier streets in town, and people often drove too fast here, especially in the morning when they were running late for work. She took small sips of her coffee while watching the cars pass by, occasionally checking their speeds on her radar unit. The morning was going smoothly. She had given out 2 warnings to drivers who were just a little over the speed limit: a young mother rushing her kids to school, and an elderly man who hadn't noticed how fast he was going. Julia always tried to use her judgment fairly, understanding that sometimes people made honest mistakes. Around 9:30 a.m., she was writing some notes in her daily log when something caught her attention. The distinctive sound of a powerful engine made her look up, and she saw a white Mercedes approaching at high speed. The radar unit's display showed the car was going well above the posted limit. Julia noticed how the expensive car seemed to gleam in the morning sun, its chrome details flashing brightly. Without hesitation, she started her patrol car's engine. This was something she had done hundreds of times before, a routine traffic stop that should only take a few minutes. As she pulled out onto the road, she switched on her lights, expecting the Mercedes to pull over right away. Most drivers did, especially in this wealthy neighborhood. The Mercedes continued for a few moments longer than necessary before finally pulling to the side of the road. Julia could see in her mirror how other drivers slowed down to look as they passed by. This was normal. People were always curious about traffic stops, especially in quiet neighborhoods like this one. As she ran the license plate through her computer, Julia noticed something interesting. The car was registered to someone named Martin Hyde, and there were several political campaign stickers on the back of the vehicle. She had seen his name in the local newspaper. He was running for Congress and had been in the news quite a bit lately. Julia took a deep breath and checked her body camera to make sure it was recording properly. This was standard procedure for every stop, but something in her gut told her to be extra careful this time. Maybe it was the way the driver had taken longer than usual to pull over, or maybe it was just her years of experience sending her a silent warning. As she stepped out of her patrol car, Julia could feel the morning sun warm on her back. She straightened her uniform and started walking toward the Mercedes, following the same careful procedure she always used. Her boots made a soft sound on the pavement, and she could hear birds singing in the nearby trees. Everything seemed normal, just another traffic stop on another beautiful Florida morning. But as she got closer to the driver's window, Julia noticed the man inside seemed unusually agitated. He was already turning in his seat to face her, his expression showing more anger than the usual embarrassment or anxiety she typically saw during traffic stops. Something told her this routine morning was about to become anything but routine. Officer Julia Martinez approached the white Mercedes with the same careful steps she had used thousands of times before. Through the tinted windows, she could see the driver already had his hands on the steering wheel, but something about his posture seemed tense and unwelcoming. The morning sun reflected off the car's spotless paint, almost making her squint. As she reached the driver's window, it smoothly slid down to reveal Martin Hyde, a man in his 50s wearing an expensive gray suit that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Campaign posters and flyers were scattered across his passenger seat, some showing his face with the bold words "Hyde for Congress" printed below. His blue tie had a small American flag pin attached to it, catching the sunlight. Good morning, sir, Julia said in her professional voice. I'm Officer Martinez with the Sarasota Police Department. Do you know why I pulled you over today? Hyde's response came quickly, his British accent sharp with irritation. I absolutely do not, he said, looking straight ahead rather than at her. I've got important meetings to attend, and I don't have time for this nonsense. Julia noticed his knuckles whitening as he gripped the steering wheel harder. She could smell expensive cologne mixing with the new car smell from inside the Mercedes. A campaign schedule was visible on his phone screen, showing several appointments for the day. Sir, I clocked you going 15 miles over the speed limit in a residential zone, Julia explained calmly. I'll need to see your license and registration, please. Hyde turned to face her now, his expression changing from annoyance to something more challenging. Do you know who I am? He asked, his voice getting louder. I'm running for Congress. I don't think you understand the mistake you're making here. The morning traffic continued to flow behind them, with some cars slowing down to watch the scene unfold. A jogger passing by on the sidewalk tried not to stare but clearly noticed the tension in the air. Julia's body camera quietly recorded everything, its small red light blinking steadily. Sir, your political status doesn't change the fact that you were speeding, Julia said firmly. License and registration, please. Hyde reached for the glove compartment with sharp, angry movements. Papers rustled as he pulled out his registration, and he practically threw his wallet onto the car's dashboard. This is ridiculous, he muttered. I'll have your badge number before this is over. As Julia took the documents, she noticed Hyde pulling out his phone. He started typing something, his fingers jabbing at the screen. I'm texting the police chief right now, he announced. We play golf together. Let's see how this goes for your career. The threat hung in the air like the morning humidity. Julia could feel a small bead of sweat rolling down her back, but her voice remained steady. She had dealt with difficult people before, but something about Hyde's attitude felt different, more entitled, more dangerous. She walked back to her patrol car to run his information, watching in her side mirror as Hyde made what appeared to be several phone calls. His animated gestures and the way he kept looking in his rearview mirror told her he wasn't finished with his threats. Inside her patrol car, Julia took a deep breath. The air conditioning helped clear her head as she typed Hyde's information into her computer. His record came up clean, but something about this stop felt wrong. Her instincts, developed over 7 years on the force, were telling her to be extra careful. Through her windshield, she could see Hyde was now standing outside his car, pacing back and forth while talking on his phone. He had ignored her instruction to stay in his vehicle, his expensive shoes clicking on the pavement as he walked. His face was red with anger, and he kept pointing at her patrol car while speaking into his phone. Julia reached for her radio. This situation was escalating beyond a simple traffic stop, and she knew she needed to call for backup. As she pressed the button to call dispatch, she watched Hyde's reflection in her mirror, his body language becoming more aggressive with each passing second. What had started as a routine speeding ticket was quickly turning into something much more serious. The situation was getting worse by the second. Martin Hyde continued pacing outside his Mercedes, his expensive shoes scraping against the pavement as he walked back and forth. His face had turned an angry shade of red, and his phone was pressed tightly against his ear. Officer Julia Martinez could hear his voice getting louder even from inside her patrol car. I don't care what you have to do, Hyde shouted into his phone. Get the chief on the line right now. This officer doesn't understand who she's dealing with. Julia spoke calmly into her radio. Dispatch, this is Officer Martinez. I need backup at 2200 Oak Avenue. Subject is being uncooperative during a traffic stop. She kept her eyes on Hyde through her windshield, watching as he ended one call and immediately started another. The morning had grown warmer, and more cars were slowing down to watch the scene. Some drivers had their phones out, recording everything through their windows. A small crowd had started to gather on the sidewalk, keeping their distance but clearly interested in what was happening. Hyde suddenly turned and marched back toward Julia's patrol car. His tie was now loose around his neck, and his perfectly styled hair had become messy from running his hands through it in frustration. Campaign flyers from his car had scattered across the street in the morning breeze, creating a trail of paper behind him. Officer, he said, his British accent getting thicker with anger, let me explain something to you. He stood uncomfortably close to her window, forcing her to step out of her car. You know who I am. I'm going to be your next congressman. One phone call from me, and you'll be directing traffic at high school football games for the rest of your career." Julia stood her ground, her right hand resting naturally near her belt. "Sir, step back from the vehicle," she said firmly. "You need to calm down and return to your car immediately." But Hyde wasn't finished. He pulled out his wallet and started waving it in the air. "You see this? I donate more to the police foundation in a month than you make in a year. Your chief and I play golf every weekend. How do you think this is going to end for you?" More patrol cars could be heard in the distance, their sirens growing louder. The sound seemed to make Hyde even angrier. He pulled out his phone again, his hands shaking as he tried to make another call. "This is harassment," he shouted, looking directly into Julia's body camera. "You're targeting me because I'm running for office. This is political persecution. When I win this election, I'm going to make sure every officer in this department understands what happens when they abuse their power." The growing crowd of onlookers had their phones out now, recording everything. A local news van had appeared at the end of the street, probably alerted by someone in the crowd. The morning sun was hitting Hyde's face, highlighting the beads of sweat that had formed on his forehead. Julia noticed how his campaign posters, scattered by the wind, seemed to mock the situation. Each one showed Hyde smiling confidently, promising leadership you can trust and integrity in office. Now here he was, threatening a police officer over a simple traffic ticket. Two more patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing in the morning sun. Officers Johnson and Rodriguez stepped out, quickly assessing the situation. Hyde's face changed slightly when he saw them. A flash of uncertainty crossed his features, but he quickly covered it with more anger. "You're all going to regret this," he said, pointing at each officer in turn. "I have connections you don't even know about. By the end of today, your careers will be over." Julia signaled to her fellow officers, and they moved to form a loose triangle around Hyde. The crowd had grown larger, and the news van was setting up its camera. What had started as a simple speeding ticket had turned into a scene that would soon be playing on every local news channel. The morning traffic continued to flow around them, creating a strange background noise to Hyde's continued threats. His voice was getting hoarse from shouting, but he showed no signs of calming down. The situation had spiraled far beyond a normal traffic stop, and everyone present knew they were watching something that would have consequences far beyond this morning. The presence of additional officers didn't calm Martin Hyde down. If anything, it seemed to fuel his anger even more. His face had turned an even deeper shade of red as he pulled out his phone again, this time putting it on speaker mode. The morning sun glinted off his American flag pin as his chest heaved with angry breaths. "Hello, Chief Harrison's office," a voice crackled through the phone's speaker. "This is Martin Hyde," he announced loudly, making sure everyone could hear. "I need to speak with the chief immediately. I'm currently being harassed by some of his officers, and I want this handled right now." Officer Julia Martinez exchanged glances with Officers Johnson and Rodriguez. They had all dealt with difficult people before, but Hyde's behavior was reaching new levels of entitlement. The news crew from Channel 7 had finished setting up their equipment and was filming everything from a safe distance. "I'm sorry, Mr. Hyde, but the chief is in a budget meeting," the voice on the phone replied. "I can have him call you back." "Unacceptable," Hyde shouted, his British accent becoming even more pronounced with his anger. "Get him out of that meeting now. Do you know who I am? I'm going to be your next congressman." More people had gathered to watch the scene unfold. Some were recording with their phones, while others whispered among themselves. A couple of expensive cars driven by people who seemed to know Hyde slowed down as they passed, their drivers looking concerned at the spectacle. Hyde turned back to face Officer Martinez, still holding his phone out like a weapon. "You see this? This is just the beginning. I have friends in the governor's office. I know judges, commissioners, everyone who matters in this town. You're making the biggest mistake of your career." Julia remained professional, her voice steady and calm. "Sir, these threats won't change the fact that you were speeding in a residential zone. We can handle this simply with a ticket, or your behavior can make things more complicated." "A ticket?" Hyde laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, there won't be any ticket. By the time I'm done, you'll be lucky if you're still wearing that badge." He turned to Officers Johnson and Rodriguez. "And that goes for all of you. I never forget faces, and I never forget who crosses me." The morning traffic continued to flow around them, creating a strange contrast to the tense scene. Hyde's campaign flyers were still scattered across the ground, their promises of leadership with integrity now seeming oddly ironic. A gentle breeze carried some of them down the street, past the growing crowd of onlookers. Hyde's phone rang, and he quickly answered it. James, finally, someone with some sense. Listen, I'm standing here with 3 of your officers who clearly don't understand how things work in this city. He started pacing again, his free hand gesturing wildly. No, you listen to me. I want them dealt with, today. I want badges on desks by this afternoon. Officer Rodriguez stepped closer to Julia. We should probably call the sergeant, he said quietly. Julia nodded, knowing the situation had escalated far beyond a routine traffic stop. Hyde ended his call and turned back to the officers, a smug smile now replacing his angry scowl. Well, that was City Commissioner James Parker. He's very interested in how his police force is treating a congressional candidate. Very interested indeed. The news crew had inched closer, the camera capturing every moment. The reporter was doing a quiet stand-up piece nearby, gesturing toward the scene while speaking into her microphone. More police vehicles were arriving, their lights flashing silently in the late morning sun. Hyde's phone buzzed again, and he checked the screen. His expression changed slightly. A flash of worry crossed his face before he covered it with more bluster. Perhaps some of his powerful friends weren't as supportive as he'd hoped. This isn't over, he declared, pointing at each officer in turn. Not by a long shot. When I win this election, and I will win, you'll all understand what real power looks like. Your careers in law enforcement. He made a dismissive gesture. Done. Finished. You'll be lucky to find work as mall security. The officers maintained their professional demeanor, but everyone present could feel that this had become more than just a traffic stop. It had turned into a test of power, the authority of law enforcement against the influence of wealth and political connections. And all of it was being captured on body cameras, news footage, and dozens of cell phones. The situation reached its breaking point when Sergeant Mike Thompson arrived at the scene. His unmarked police car pulled up quietly, lights off, but his presence immediately changed the atmosphere. The morning had grown hot, and the crowd of onlookers had swelled to nearly 50 people, all watching the drama unfold. Martin Hyde was still making calls on his phone, but his voice had grown hoarse from shouting. His expensive suit was now wrinkled, and dark sweat stains had formed under his arms. Every few minutes, he would glance at the news crew, seeming to realize that this scene was being broadcast live across the city. Sir, Sergeant Thompson said as he approached, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of experience, I understand there's been some difficulty here this morning. Hyde spun around to face the sergeant, his phone still pressed to his ear. Finally, someone with actual authority. Do you know who I am? I've been trying to explain to your officers that. Yes, Mr. Hyde, I know who you are, Thompson interrupted calmly. I also know that you were recorded threatening my officers over a routine traffic stop. That's a serious matter. Officer Julia Martinez stood nearby, her body camera still recording everything. She watched as Hyde's face went through a series of emotions, anger, surprise, and then something that looked like fear. The realization that his threats had been recorded seemed to hit him for the first time. Those weren't threats, Hyde said quickly, his tone changing. I was simply explaining my position in the community. These officers have been completely unprofessional. Do you know I had to miss an important campaign meeting because of this? A light breeze carried the sound of whispers from the crowd. Someone in the back shouted, "Show some respect." Others nodded in agreement. The news crew had moved closer, their camera focused on Hyde's increasingly desperate expressions. Sergeant Thompson took out his notebook, flipping it open with practiced ease. Let's review what's happened here, he said. You were stopped for speeding in a residential zone. Instead of accepting the ticket, you threatened Officer Martinez's career, claimed you would have her badge, called multiple city officials to try to intimidate her, and refused to comply with basic instructions. Hyde's phone rang again, but this time he didn't answer it. His campaign manager had arrived and was trying to push through the crowd, looking horrified at the scene before him. More campaign flyers blew across the street, their promises of strong leadership seeming more hollow with each passing moment. This is ridiculous, Hyde said, but his voice had lost some of its earlier confidence. I demand to speak with the chief of police right now. This is a clear case of harassment. Officer Rodriguez stepped forward, holding up his own body camera. Sir, we have everything recorded. Every threat, every phone call, every attempt to use your position to avoid a simple traffic ticket. The crowd had grown larger, and more news vans were arriving. The morning sun was now high in the sky, casting harsh shadows that seemed to highlight the tension in Hyde's face. His campaign manager finally reached him, whispering urgently in his ear, but Hyde pushed him away. You don't understand, Hyde said, his voice cracking slightly. I'm running for Congress. This will ruin everything. I can't have this kind of publicity. Just tear up the ticket, and we can all forget this happened. Sergeant Thompson shook his head slowly. Mr. Hyde, your behavior this morning has turned a simple traffic violation into something much more serious. We have multiple officers witnessing your attempts to obstruct justice, threats against law enforcement, and failure to comply with lawful orders. The reality of his situation finally seemed to sink in. Hyde looked around at the cameras, the crowd, and the group of officers surrounding him. His phone had been ringing nonstop, but he no longer seemed interested in answering it. His campaign manager was frantically making calls of his own, trying to manage the growing media crisis. What had started as a routine traffic stop had become the moment that would define Martin Hyde's campaign, and it was all captured on camera, ready to be shared across every news channel and social media platform in the country. By noon that same day, the video of Martin Hyde's traffic stop had spread like wildfire across the internet. In the break room of the Sarasota Police Department, Officer Julia Martinez watched as her fellow officers gathered around a TV screen showing the local news. The headline at the bottom of the screen read, Congressional candidate threatens police officer during traffic stop. Breaking news from Sarasota this afternoon, the news anchor announced, her voice serious. Body camera footage has emerged showing congressional candidate Martin Hyde threatening a police officer during what should have been a routine traffic stop this morning. The footage played on the screen, showing Hyde's angry face as he shouted, Do you know who I am? The clear audio captured every threat, every attempt to use his connections to intimidate Officer Martinez. The department's phones have been ringing nonstop since the video was released. Julia, one of her colleagues, called out, holding up his phone, You're trending on Twitter. People are calling you a hero for standing up to him. Social media was exploding with reactions. Regular people were sharing the video and adding their own comments about privilege and abuse of power. Some posted screenshots of Hyde's campaign website, pointing out the irony between his promises of honest leadership and his behavior in the video. Local news crews had set up their vans outside the police station, hoping to get interviews with Officer Martinez or any other officers involved. The police chief had called an emergency press conference for later that afternoon to address the situation. In his campaign office across town, Martin Hyde sat with his team, watching his political dreams crumble in real time. His campaign manager frantically made phone calls, trying to control the damage, but it was too late. The video had already been picked up by national news networks. It's being shared everywhere, a young staff member reported, scrolling through her phone. CNN, Fox News, MSNBC, they're all running the story. Even late-night TV hosts are starting to tweet about it. Hyde's phone kept buzzing with messages from supporters and donors, many of them wanting to distance themselves from the scandal. The political allies he had bragged about during the traffic stop were now refusing to take his calls. His expensive suit jacket lay crumpled on a chair, his American flag pin slightly crooked. Back at the police station, Sergeant Thompson was reviewing the incident report with Officer Martinez. You handled yourself perfectly out there, he said, nodding at the report. By the book, professional, exactly what we expect from our officers. More footage from bystanders' phones had started appearing online, showing different angles of the incident. Each new video seemed to make Hyde look worse. His attempts to use his power and connections had backfired completely, turning him into a symbol of everything people disliked about politicians. Local community leaders began issuing statements supporting the police department. The mayor's office released a brief comment. We stand behind our police officers and their professional handling of all situations, regardless of who is involved. Officer Martinez's inbox filled with messages of support from fellow officers across the country. Many shared similar stories of dealing with powerful people who thought they were above the law. Her simple traffic stop had touched a nerve with people everywhere. By late afternoon, Hyde's biggest campaign donors had started pulling their support. His campaign website, which that morning had been full of confident promises about fighting corruption, now displayed a simple under-maintenance message. The video continued to spread, gaining millions of views. News channels played it on repeat, political commentators discussed it, and social media users turned Hyde's words into memes. His threat of "Do you know who I am?" had become a symbol of privileged behavior and abuse of power. Outside the police station, reporters waited patiently, hoping to get a statement from Officer Martinez. Inside, she continued with her regular duties, handling the sudden attention with the same calm professionalism she had shown during the traffic stop. The incident had transformed from a local police matter into a national conversation about power, privilege, and accountability. Sometimes, Sergeant Thompson said to the gathered officers, "The best way to handle power is to simply do your job by the book." He looked at Officer Martinez with approval. That's exactly what happened here, and now everyone can see it for themselves. The next morning brought the full weight of consequences for Martin Hyde. His campaign office, usually busy with volunteers and staff, sat nearly empty. Campaign posters that had once covered the walls were now being taken down, leaving behind small holes where pins had held them in place. The morning sun streamed through the windows, illuminating dust particles floating in the quiet air. Hyde sat alone at his desk, watching news coverage of himself on a laptop. Every major network was playing the video of his traffic stop, analyzing his behavior frame by frame. Political commentators picked apart his words, body language, and threats. His phone, which had never stopped ringing during yesterday's incident, was now strangely silent. Breaking news. Hyde campaign staff resigns en masse, scrolled across the bottom of his screen. His campaign manager and most of the senior staff had quit early that morning, releasing a joint statement that said they could no longer support a candidate who showed such disrespect for law enforcement. In another part of town, Officer Julia Martinez arrived at the police station for her regular shift. Her fellow officers greeted her with respectful nods and supportive smiles. The chief had given her the option to take a few days off, but she had declined. "The best thing to do," she had said, "is to keep doing my job." Hyde's major donors were quickly distancing themselves. The local newspaper's website showed a list of businesses and individuals who had publicly withdrawn their support. The campaign office's landlord had even posted a notice saying they would not renew the lease when it expired next month. "I don't understand," Hyde muttered to himself, scrolling through endless social media posts about the incident. "I apologized. I said I was sorry." But his apology, posted late last night on his campaign's social media accounts, had only made things worse. People called it insincere, pointing out that he had only apologized after the video went viral. The police department's public information office was flooded with interview requests for Officer Martinez. National morning shows wanted her to share her. 1 month after the traffic stop incident, the Sarasota Police Department held a special ceremony. Officer Julia Martinez stood in front of her fellow officers, community leaders, and local media as the police chief pinned a commendation medal to her uniform. The small auditorium was packed with people who wanted to witness this moment. "Officer Martinez demonstrated exactly what we expect from our officers," the chief said into the microphone. "Professionalism, calm under pressure, and equal treatment under the law for everyone, regardless of their status or connections." In the back of the room, several rookie officers watched attentively. The video of Martinez's traffic stop with Martin Hyde had become required viewing at the police academy. Instructors used it to teach new officers how to handle difficult situations with powerful people. Meanwhile, across town, Hyde's former campaign office stood empty. A "For Rent" sign hung in the window, gently swaying in the breeze. Inside, a few forgotten campaign posters collected dust on the floor. The space where he had once dreamed of launching himself to Congress was now just another vacant storefront. Hyde himself had not been seen in public for weeks. His social media accounts were deleted, his phone number changed. The last anyone had heard, he had moved back to England, leaving behind the ruins of his political career and business relationships. The incident had created lasting changes in the community. Local politicians now made a point of being extra polite during traffic stops, often recording themselves cooperating with law enforcement and posting the videos online. "I know exactly who I am, a citizen equal under the law," became a popular phrase among public officials. Officer Martinez's body camera footage was now being used in police departments across the country. Training officers would pause the video at key moments, asking their students, "What would you do in this situation?" The incident had become a textbook example of how power, privilege, and law enforcement intersected. The most important lesson, Martinez explained to a group of cadets one afternoon, isn't about dealing with angry people or handling threats. It's about remembering that the law applies equally to everyone. Local schools invited her to speak to students about civic responsibility and the importance of treating everyone with respect. Children would raise their hands to ask questions, genuinely curious about what it meant to be a police officer in their community. Hyde's famous question, "Do you know who I am?" had taken on a life of its own. It became a catchphrase, used to mock entitled behavior wherever it appeared. Television shows referenced it, comedians included it in their routines, and social media users turned it into countless memes. The police department had seen positive changes too. More citizens were recording their interactions with officers, but not to catch bad behavior. They wanted to show examples of good police work. The relationship between law enforcement and the community had grown stronger. In her patrol car, Officer Martinez kept a small newspaper clipping about the incident, not to remember Hyde or his threats, but to remind herself why she became a police officer in the first place, to serve her community fairly and professionally. The traffic stop location had become a minor local landmark. People would drive by and point it out to visitors. That's where that congressional candidate learned he wasn't above the law. Some even took selfies there, posting them with hashtags about accountability and justice. 1 year after the incident, a local government ethics committee used the case to create new guidelines for political candidates. They called it the Professional Conduct in Public Service Policy, though everyone informally called it the Hyde Rule. The story had become part of Sarasota's history, taught in local civics classes and discussed in community meetings. It served as a reminder that in a nation of laws, no one's connections or wealth could put them above those laws. Hyde's last public statement had been a lengthy written apology, published in the local newspaper. This time, unlike his first rushed apology, it seemed genuine. He acknowledged his mistakes, the damage he had caused, and the lessons he had learned about power, privilege, and respect. As Officer Martinez finished her shift that evening, driving past the spot where it all happened, she reflected on how a simple traffic stop had turned into something much more meaningful, a lesson about equality, justice, and the true meaning of public service.